All right, so in this video we're going to look at higher mental functions. So an analysis of higher mental functions includes things like language, memory, and we can actually look at brain waves with a device called an EEG or electrocephalogram. This also includes consciousness, so we'll talk about consciousness or awareness of your environment and self. And then we'll also talk about sleep and sleep-wake cycles. So language is this kind of fascinating thing because humans and other animals, we have this capacity for language, which is an ability to communicate information with each other. So language implementation involves association cortices in the frontal and parietal and temporal lobes. So the main areas of language include Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area is the motor speech area of your frontal lobe. It's found in the kind of the posterior frontal lobe. And so Broca's area is necessary for the motor output to the muscles that are involved with the production of speech. So if individuals have damage to Broca's area, they can still understand words, but they'll have difficulty producing them. So what you'll find is with people with Broca's aphasia or damage, they could maybe speak in very short sentences or even like mumbled, kind of jumbled words. However, they can still understand speech because understanding speech, whether it's written or spoken, involves a different brain region called Wernicke's area. So Wernicke's area is involved with understanding these spoken and written words, and that is found in the posterior temporal lobe, kind of on the border there between the temporal and parietal lobes. Now, individuals with Wernicke's aphasia or damage here won't be able to understand words, but they'll still be able to produce them. However, because they can't hear their own words being produced, the words that they do produce will be nonsensible and just kind of muttered. So corresponding areas on the right side are involved with nonverbal language components. So when you think about like functions of the right brain in terms of intuition, we find that the right brain's involved with kind of inflection of words, the emotional impact of words, and kind of analyzing people's emotional qualities to their language. So if you look here on this slide, we find the motor speech area, Broca's region, right here in the frontal lobe, and it's just anterior to the premotor cortex and primary motor cortex. So this is the Broca's region or motor speech area. So individuals with damage to this specific region of their brain basically won't be able to produce words. Now the Wernicke's area is back here. It's a completely separate region, and this is found on the border of the temporal and parietal lobes. So Wernicke's is part of the posterior association area, but this one's involved with understanding written and spoken words. It's interesting how these functions are separate. Now memories is kind of a fascinating thing, right? Because it's essentially something that ties us to our past. And we can use memories for our own advantage in terms of storing and retrieving important information. Now there's different types of memory. Now declarative memory includes things like facts, right? So names, faces, words, dates, that's all declarative memory. Procedural memory is for skills, things like playing the piano. So when you think about like where procedural memory is stored, that's kind of like muscle memory or motor memory, which is a memory of motor skills like riding a bike. Now these ones are stored in the motor regions of your brain, whereas declarative memory would be more like in the regions of your brain that would be associated with verbal types of memory, right? Like remembering someone's name or words or dates. Now emotional memory is a memory of experiences that are linked to a particular emotion, right? So you can associate memories with an emotion, and so the example your book gives here is when your heart pounds, when you hear rattlesnakes, because you've heard that rattlesnake sound before, knowing what it is, then you get the emotional response to that. So we can actually divide memory into short and long term. So STM is short-term memory. We call this working memory, and it's basically just a temporary storage site of information. Long-term memory, LTM, has a virtually limitless capacity. Scientists haven't determined if long-term memory storage is limitless yet, because there's individuals that can remember seemingly limitless amounts of information. Now there are different factors that influence the transfer of short-term memory into long-term memory. So the first memories that you form are going to be in the short-term sort of conscious state. Now, if you have various factors and all these conditions are just right, then those short-term memories can be stored in long-term. And long-term memory is stored for a potentially limitless amount of time, or I guess limited by your age. So now what we find here is that the four major factors include emotional state, rehearsal, association, and automatic memory. So emotionally, you remember things best if you're alert, motivated, surprised, or aroused. So this makes sense because you can tie in memories and associate those with an emotional experience so you learn them better. Now, rehearsal is important too because repetition and practice help with long-term potentiation, which we talked about. Potentiation was a strengthening of synapses, and so rehearsal can help strengthen those synapses. Now, association is where we can tie new information to previous information. So if you've learned about cells before, learning a new thing about cells would be easier because you can tie that with your previous memory of what a cell is. And then automatic memory is more of like subconscious information that's stored in long-term memory. Now, memories will be consolidated when they're stored long-term in the cortex, and so they can fit into kind of facts and categories. And this consolidation requires several different brain regions, like your hippocampus, which remember, if you remember, is part of your limbic system, and also involves temporal cortical areas, your thalamus, which was involved with sensory relay and the reticular activating system. We have your prefrontal cortex, which is also involved with consolidation. So if we look at just the general flow chart of how memories are formed, it all starts with your senses, right? Because your senses are the only thing that connect you to the outside world. So outside stimuli are picked up by your senses, whether it's like touch, hearing, smell, or sight. And these senses are sent to the central nervous system where they're basically temporarily stored. Now, they can be stored in a variety of different regions, but if you're thinking of like conscious memories, then that's going to be stored in the cerebral cortex. And if you don't use this information, or if you don't pay attention to it, that information is permanently lost. And that's not always a bad thing. Like, we don't always want to remember every single thing that our senses are exposed to because we would be overwhelmed with a bunch of useless information. So forgetting or losing information is actually an important process of memory formation. So if you can basically focus your attention and emotional aspects on those different types of information that you're receiving, that can be selected for transfer into short-term memory. Short-term memory lasts for on the order of seconds to minutes, and we can think about short-term memory as being kind of a area where information is sort of transient and it's always kind of coming and going. Where if you don't want to store that information long term, then you can just forget it, right? So again, you can lose that information because it might not be important. However, if your brain determines that that information is important, you can consolidate that into long-term memory. So consolidation into long-term memory involves excitement, rehearsal, and association. And so long-term memories are stored for an indefinite amount of time. And if these long-term memories aren't retrieved, very frequently, it's possible that that information could be unretrievable. And so that you might have the memories there in your brain, but if they're not tied with other ways for access, then they might be lost forever. But again, forgetting is an important process because you don't want to remember every single thing that you've ever been exposed to. So we can also look at brain activity using a device called electroencephalogram, or EEG. So what this device does is it records the electrical activity that accompanies brain function. And essentially there's a series of electrodes that surround your scalp and skull in a variety of different regions. And it's used for things like diagnosing epilepsy or sleep disorders. We can localize lesions and tumors, or even infarcts and infections based off of these waveforms. We can use EEGs in research to determine, if brain death has occurred, or electrodes that are placed in the scalp can actually measure the voltage changes that occur when action potentials are occurring. So if you look at an EEG, essentially what you're seeing is the cumulative effect of all of the action potentials that are occurring in your brain at any moment in time. So this is what the EEG would look like, where you have these electrodes that are placed on the scalp. There's a conductive gel that would sit just beneath the electrode, and basically it picks up magnetic fields that are emanating away from your brain. Now those magnetic fields are generated as a consequence of action potentials, and what you're essentially doing here is measuring the cumulative influence of all the action potentials in your brain in each moment, and that's sent to a device for analysis. So these EEGs specifically measure patterns of neuronal electrical activity, mostly in the cortex, because the cortex is more superficial. It's easier to measure the electrical activity there. So each person's brain waves are kind of unique, and the patterns can change with age, different types of sensory stimuli, brain disease, or even the chemical state of your body. So you can use EEGs to get a kind of inside glimpse of what's going on in the brain. Now, we measure these waves in frequency, or hertz, and essentially it tells us the number of peaks per second. So 1 hertz is basically 1 peak per second. And we can group the major waveforms into 4 main classes. We have alpha, beta, theta, and delta. Alpha waves are at 8 to 13 hertz. They're regular and rhythmic, low amplitude, synchronous waves that it kind of indicate an idling brain. So if you're just relaxed but awake, then you'll have alpha waves. Beta waves are about 14 to 30 hertz, so they're at a higher frequency. They're rhythmic, but they're less regular, and these occur mostly when you're mentally alert. So if you're really focused on an object or a task at hand, then you're more likely to have these beta waves. Theta waves are a lower frequency type of wave that are also pretty irregular. You find these more commonly in children, but very uncommonly in adults. And then the delta waves are an even lower frequency type of wave that have high amplitude, but you see this during deep sleep or when the reticular activating system is suppressed. So you can look at delta waves to determine if someone is awake or not, or if your anesthesia has put them into a state of sleep. So we can also determine this as a sign of brain damage in awake adults. So if someone's awake but they have delta waves, that can indicate brain damage. So what do these waves look like? Well, essentially, the EEG readout would give us this kind of wave pattern here. We have alpha, beta, theta, delta. So you see the alpha waves are awake but relaxed. So they're not a super high frequency type of wave, but you can tell that this individual is awake based on their frequency here, and they're very regular pattern of appearance. The beta waves are awake and alert, where you have a higher frequency, but they're more irregular. So you see here where it looks fairly regular here, but then it speeds up, and it speeds up even faster here, where it's high frequency, irregular rhythm, and this indicates an individual's awake and alert, and they're kind of processing complex information. Now, theta waves are common in children, so you have a lower frequency, a little bit higher amplitude type of wave, and you can sometimes see this in adults. Delta waves indicate deep sleep, where it's a low frequency, high amplitude type of wave here, and this would indicate sleep. But if you find this in an awake adult, this can also indicate brain damage. So maybe if you're wondering what consciousness is, ultimately what we define as consciousness is the perception of sensation. If you can perceive your own senses, right? If you say that I see or I hear or I taste, that in itself is consciousness. So it's an awareness of your environment and yourself. Now, consciousness also involves the voluntary initiation and control of movement. So if you can move your own body around, that's a conscious type of activity. And these capabilities are associated with higher mental processing like memory, logic, and judgment. Now, clinically, we define consciousness on a continuum that grades in behavior. So we can define consciousness based on alertness, drowsiness, stupor, and coma. And ultimately, we can measure these things to determine the degree of consciousness that someone has. Now, the current suppositions on consciousness is that it involves a wide range of cortical activity, and it's superimposed on other neural activities. So there's not one place in your brain that's conscious. It actually involves a wide range of brain regions. And the evidence for this is if someone has a stroke to a specific area of their cortex, it's not as though they're no longer conscious. It's just they might lose some functions associated with that area. And so what we find is that consciousness is actually holistic and totally interconnected because it involves pretty wide spans of your cortex and your whole brain. Now, sleep is fascinating because we spend probably close to about a third of our lives in sleep state. And sleep is this state of partial unconsciousness. Now, cortical activity is depressed during sleep, but brainstem activity doesn't change. Remember, sleep is actually going to be mediated in part by the reticular activating system that, in a sleep state doesn't send information to the cortex as well. But it's also timed by things like your hypothalamus and epithalamus to regulate the rhythm of sleep. Now, there's different types of sleep. We have non-rapid eye movement, or NREM. This is kind of a deeper stage of sleep. And then rapid eye movement, or REM, which is not a deep stage of sleep, and this would actually just precede an awake state. So while you're awake, you're going to have a higher frequency on the EEG waveforms here. When an individual is in REM, it's a little bit lower frequency. And then as we slip into different stages of non-rapid eye movement type of sleep, they become lower and lower frequencies. So with REM sleep, what we find here is that skeletal muscles are going to be inhibited so that you're not going to be moving your limbs around, but you're close to an awake state, so this is where most dreaming occurs because you're still somewhat conscious. Now, in a deeper stage of sleep, we have NREM, stage 1, and this is where relaxation begins, and EEG shows sort of slower alpha waves, and arousal is actually easier in this stage. Stage 2 NREM is where you have irregular EEGs with short amplitude bursts. Arousal becomes more difficult as we slip into stage 3, where sleep even deepens. We have theta and delta waves, and the vital signs also decline. So you have lower blood pressure, lower respiratory rhythm, because you're less metabolically active here. And then stage 4 NREM is where EEGs are dominated by the delta waves. This is your deep sleep. Arousal is difficult, but this is also the stage of sleep where things like bedwetting occurs, night terrors can occur, or even sleepwalking may occur in some individuals. So what regulates sleep is a variety of different brain regions. We talked about how it's on a 24-hour rhythm, which is just a solar day, and the reticular activating system that involves your brainstem and thalamus also helps to mediate the sleep stages, because we talked about the RAS helps to send information to the cortex to alert the brain of incoming information. Now, if the RAS is less active, then you find that the cortex isn't receiving information as well, so that you're no longer conscious of that information. The suprachiasmatic and preoptic nuclei of your hypothalamus also help time sleep cycles, and this is because the hypothalamus releases orexins that are a type of molecule that can help the cortex wake up. And then we also find that it involves the epithalamus, because that has the pineal gland that releases melatonin that can also help time the circadian rhythm. Now, typical sleep patterns alternate between REM and non-REM sleep. So if you look at, let's say a 7-hour sleep span here, where once you're awake, you can kind of rapidly slip into NREM. And ultimately what you do is you'll dive down deep into deep sleep, kind of work your way back up into REM, and then back down again, back up into REM, and then back down again. And you can see here that you're just kind of slowly waking up towards the end of sleep. And it's kind of an interesting phenomenon here where we slip deeply into sleep initially, but then over the course of the night, we slowly stop going into deeper stages of sleep up until the point of, awake at the end of sleep, and maybe in the morning sometime. Now, the importance of sleep is interesting because every animal sleeps. So we find then that it's across the animal kingdom, and it's a fascinating thing because you spend about a third of your life in this type of brain state. Now, slow wave sleep is presumed to be restorative, right? So you think about like NREM stages 3 and 4 is restorative because your metabolism can slow down, your cells can repair. Psychologically, what we find is that people that are deprived of sleep can become moody and depressed, but REM sleep could be an opportunity, dreaming rather, can be an opportunity for your brain to analyze the day's events and work through emotional events or problems. But it could also be involved with eliminating unneeded synapses that were formed during the day, so that dreaming may be a process of forgetting. Now, what we find though is as we age, their daily sleep requirements will decline. So stage 4 sleep declines steadily and may even disappear after age 60. So you find less and less of this really deep restorative type of sleep. And this might be something that contributes to age-related bodily decline, because sleep is restorative in that regard. In fact, if you look at cells of individuals who lack sleep, you can find that their organelles appear to be more degraded because they haven't had a chance to rest and relax.